Welcome to Papers Simplified, a podcast brought to you by SILMA AI.
Great to be here.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really interesting research paper. It's called The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. Quite a title.
It definitely grabs your attention, and it tackles something pretty fundamental about these advanced AI models, the ones that are supposed to reason.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this paper. We want to understand what these large reasoning models, or LRMs, are supposed to be.
Right.
How the researchers evaluated them, what they found about their strengths, but maybe more importantly, their weaknesses, and what it all means for AI reasoning.
And this comes from researchers linked to Apple, looking at some of the big-name frontier models.
Yeah. And the abstract sort of sets the stage, right? It mentions these LRMs generate thinking tokens, these explicit steps, and seem better on benchmarks.
But, and this is the key point from the get-go, there are big questions. Are they really understanding? How do they scale? What are the limits? They also flag issues with current benchmarks, like contamination.
Meaning the models might have already seen the test questions or something very similar during training?
Precisely. So the benchmarks might not be measuring true reasoning on novel problems, and they only look at the final answer, not the process.
So the paper's approach is different.
Yeah, they use these controlled puzzles. It lets them really dig into how the models try to solve problems, not just if they get the final answer right, and they can control the difficulty precisely.
Okay, let's get into that. The paper starts by introducing these LRMs as sort of the next step after standard large language models, LLMs.
Right, they mention models like OpenAI's O1, O3, DeepSeek R1, Claude 3.7, Sonnet Thinking, Gemini Thinking. The common thread is this explicit thinking step.
Like chain of thought, maybe with some self-correction built in.
Exactly. It generates this whole trace that looks like it's working through the problem step by step.
But the paper immediately asks, even with these traces and good benchmark scores, what's really going on? Is it genuine reasoning?
Or is it super advanced pattern matching? That's the core question. And how does it hold up when things get really complex?
And how do they compare to, say, a standard LLM if you just let the standard one try multiple times using similar amounts of computation?
Yeah. Is the thinking structure itself inherently better, or is it just a way to use more compute? And critically, where does this approach break down? What are the limits?
The paper argues pretty strongly that the usual tests, math problems, coding challenges aren't enough.
Right, because of the potential contamination we mentioned, and because they're black boxes. You don't see the reasoning, just the result.
Which leads to the big question. How do you evaluate reasoning properly then?
And their answer is these controlled puzzle environments. Think of them like little logic sandboxes.
Sandboxes where you can turn the difficulty up or down.
Exactly. You can precisely control complexity. And because the rules are crystal clear, you can check every single step the model proposes in its thinking trace using a simulator.
Ah, okay. So you can see where it goes wrong, not just that it went wrong.
Precisely. It allows a much deeper look inside the process.
Now, before they jump fully into the puzzles, they do briefly look at some standard math benchmarks, right?
Yeah.
Like Math 500 and AIM.
They do, yeah. It's sort of a bridge. They wanted to see if the patterns there gave any clues.
And what did they find? Was it clear that the thinking models were better?
Well, that's the interesting part. It was inconsistent. On one benchmark, Math 500, the thinking models were basically comparable to the non-thinking ones if you gave them similar compute.
So no clear advantage there.
Right. But on others, the AIM benchmarks, the thinking models did perform better. The gap widened.
Okay, so what does that suggest? Does thinking help with harder problems?
That's one possibility the paper considers. Maybe AIM is just complex enough that the thinking structure helps. Or
maybe it's the contamination issue again.
Exactly. They point out something really fishy with AIME24 versus AIM25. Humans found AIME25 slightly easier, but the models did worse on AIME25 than AIM24.
That is weird. You'd expect generally better reasoning models to do better on the easier test.
Right. It strongly hints the models might have been trained on AIME24 data, making it an unreliable test of generalization.
So these standard benchmarks are just too ambiguous for what they wanted to study.
Pretty much. Too many confounding factors, not enough control, which is why they pivoted fully to the puzzles.
Okay, let's talk about these puzzles. What were they?
They used 4 main ones, all classics that need step-by-step logic. First, Tower of Hanoi.
Ah, yes. Moving the disks between pegs, bigger can't go on smaller.
Right. Complexity is just the number of disks, N. And the number of moves needed grows exponentially. They checked for correctness of moves, not necessarily the shortest solution.
Okay, what else?
Then checker jumping. swapping red and blue checkers on a line using slides or jumps. Complexity scales with n, the number of checkers of each color. Again, just checking for a correct sequence. Third was river crossing, the classic type with constraints like missionaries and cannibals or farmers with wolves, goats, cabbage. You have agents, a boat, capacity limits, safety rules.
Right. Can't leave certain things together unsupervised.
Exactly. Complexity depends on the number of pairs of agents, N, and the boat capacity, K.
And the fourth.
Blocks world. Stacking and unstacking blocks to match a target configuration. Complexity is just the number of blocks, N.
So what makes these puzzles better than the math benchmarks for this study?
Several things. One, precise complexity control, just change N or K. Two, very unlikely to be contaminated in the training data in these specific forms. Three, they absolutely require algorithmic, rule-based thinking.
And critically.
Critically, you can build simulators to check every single step the model outputs in its thought process. They could see exactly when and how the reasoning went wrong.
They also looked at how the required number of steps, the compositional depth, relates to difficulty.
Yeah, they did. Unsurprisingly, accuracy drops as the required steps increase within a puzzle. But interestingly, models struggle differently across puzzles, even if they needed a similar number of steps.
So difficulty isn't just about the number of moves. There's something else going on.
Seems like it. Maybe the type of logic or the state space size.
Okay, let's get to the experiments. Section 4. This is where they tested the models on these puzzles.
Right. They used models where they could see the thinking Claude 3.7 Sonnet, comparing thinking versus non-thinking versions, and DeepSeek models. Plus O3 Mini for some final accuracy checks. They ran multiple trials for each puzzle setup.
So the big question first. How did complexity actually affect reasoning performance?
This is one of the main findings. They compared thinking versus non-thinking models across the different puzzles and complexity levels.
What emerged?
They found three really distinct regimes of performance based on how complex the puzzle was. N.
Okay, what's regime 1?
Low complexity, the really easy versions. And here, surprisingly, the non-thinking models were often better, more accurate, and more efficient, using fewer tokens.
Huh. So the thinking part actually got in the way.
It seems like it, yeah. Maybe unnecessary overhead for simple tasks. Overthinking, perhaps.
Okay, regime 2.
Medium complexity. Here, the thinking model started to shine. They used more compute, generated more tokens, but achieved significantly higher accuracy than the non-thinking ones.
So that fits the intuition thinking helps when things get a bit tricky.
Right. But then came regime 3.
High complexity.
High complexity. And here, performance just collapsed for both types of models. Accuracy dropped effectively to 0.
A complete failure.
A complete failure. The thinking models might have delayed this collapse slightly, pushing the threshold a bit further out, but they absolutely hit a wall too. They couldn't overcome it.
Wow. So there's a hard limit, regardless of the thinking mechanism.
That's what the data strongly suggests. When they focused just on the thinking models themselves, looking across different ones like O3 Mini, DeepSeek, Claude thinking, the pattern was clear. Accuracy falls off a cliff as n increases, hits 0.
But here's where it gets really interesting, right? The scaling limit thing. They looked at the effort the models put in.
Exactly. This is super counterintuitive. They measured effort by the number of thinking tokens generated. You'd think harder problem, more thinking, more tokens.
Makes sense.
But that's not what happened consistently. Effort did increase initially with complexity. But then, as the problems got really hard, approaching that collapse point, the effort actually started to decline.
Wait, they generated fewer thinking steps when the problem was hardest,
Oh.
even if they hadn't run out of their token budget.
Yes. Even with plenty of compute available. It's like
Yeah.
they recognized the task was intractable for them and just stopped trying productively. It suggests a fundamental bottleneck in using computation effectively for reasoning beyond a certain complexity.
That's fascinating. It's not just hitting a resource limit. It's like an internal capability limit.
Precisely. Now, they didn't just look at the final outcome or token counts. They dug into the content of those thinking traces.
Using the simulators to check the intermediate steps.
Exactly. They validated the steps within the thoughts generated by models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet thinking.
And this confirmed those 3 regimes.
It did, and it revealed how things were working or failing within each regime.
Okay, so for simple problems.
For simple problems, they often found the right answer or path quite early in the thought process. But then they kept going, exploring wrong paths, making mistakes after having found a solution. This is what they called overthinking.
So the accuracy could actually decrease later in the thought process.
Yeah, for simple n, the accuracy sometimes went down over time. The first correct solution appeared earlier than the first wrong step, on average.
Weird. What about moderate complexity?
There, the pattern shifted. The correct solutions tended to appear later, after the model had tried some incorrect paths first. Accuracy might improve slightly or stay level as thinking went on, more like exploration, maybe finding its way.
And high complexity. The collapse mode.
In collapse mode, the traces just showed failure. They simply couldn't produce valid intermediate steps according to the puzzle rules. The simulator showed they weren't making progress at all.
So looking inside the thoughts really paints a picture of how they fail. It's not just getting the end wrong, it's getting lost in the steps.
Right. And the analysis showed that while thinking models might manage more correct steps on average before failing compared to simpler models, their failure wasn't always predictable. Sometimes they'd fail earlier on a harder instance than an easier one, suggesting a kind of brittleness or inconsistency in applying the rules.
Which brings us to the next section, puzzling behavior.
Right.
Because some findings were genuinely unexpected.
Definitely. One of the more striking ones was when they tried to help the Tower of Hanoi puzzle.
How do they help?
They literally gave the model the explicit step-by-step algorithm for solving it, right in the prompt. Pseudocode and everything.
Okay, you'd think that would make a huge difference, right? Like giving it the answer key, almost.
You'd think, but amazingly, it didn't significantly improve performance. The accuracy collapse still happened at roughly the same complexity level.
Wow. So even with the exact instructions, it couldn't reliably follow them when things got complex.
Seems so. It suggests the limitation isn't just about finding the strategy, but about executing it consistently and correctly step by step. It raises real questions about their symbolic manipulation abilities.
It's like knowing the recipe isn't enough if you can't actually follow the steps precisely for a complex dish.
That's a good analogy. And then there was another really puzzling finding, the inconsistency between puzzle types.
What do you mean?
Well, look at Claude 3.7's sonnet thinking. On Tower of Hanoi, it could sometimes manage sequences around 100 correct moves before making a mistake for N10.
Okay, that sounds reasonably robust.
But on the river crossing puzzle, the same model failed after only about 4 correct moves for N3.
4 moves. But wait, how many moves does N3 river crossing even need?
Only about 11 total moves, compared to over 100 for N10 Tower of Hanoi. The model was dramatically less consistent on a puzzle that was objectively much shorter and simpler in terms of total steps.
That is puzzling. Why would it be so much worse on the shorter puzzle?
The paper speculates it might come back to the training data again. Maybe models have just seen way more examples of Tower of Hanoi being a classic computer science problem than they have of river crossing, especially with slightly larger N.
So performance might still be heavily tied to familiarity, not just pure logical capacity.
That seems to be a strong possibility based on this result. It undermines the idea of purely general reasoning ability.
Okay, so let's bring this together. The paper's conclusion and limitations. What's the final verdict?
The main takeaway is that current LRMs, despite the thinking mechanisms, have pretty fundamental limitations. They hit a wall, a complexity threshold beyond which they collapse.
And this happens even with things like self-reflection.
Right. The 3 performance regimes seem robust, and that counterintuitive finding about reduced thinking effort near the collapse point highlights a real scaling bottleneck.
Plus, the trace analysis showing overthinking on simple stuff and total failure on complex stuff.
Exactly, and they reiterate those really surprising findings, the struggle to follow explicit algorithms, and the strange inconsistency across different puzzle types.
Do they acknowledge limitations in their own study?
Oh yes, definitely. They're clear that these puzzles represent a specific, narrow type of reasoning. Most experiments used APIs, so no deep internal analysis was possible, and the simulation assumes perfect step validation, which is harder in the real world.
That was a really thorough look. Let's just quickly recap the absolute key takeaways, the novel points this paper brings to the table.
Sure, I think some of the main contributions are, first, really questioning standard benchmarks due to contamination and their inability to show how models reason. That's a crucial critique. Second, introducing and validating the use of these controlled puzzle environments. That's a methodological step forward for studying reasoning rigorously.
Right, the simulators.
Third, identifying those 3 distinct performance regimes, non-thinking better low, thinking better medium, both collapse high. That's a clear framework. Fourth, demonstrating that hard collapse threshold, it's not just degrading performance, it's a cliff edge for all the frontier models they tested on these tasks.
Yeah, that was stark.
Fifth, uncovering that counterintuitive scaling limit where thinking effort decreases near the collapse. That's a super important finding about how these models utilize compute under stress.
Definitely unexpected.
Sixth, the fine-grained trace analysis providing concrete evidence for things like overthinking and showing the nature of failure at high complexity. It's not just accuracy, it's how they fail.
And finally,
And finally, highlighting those puzzling limitations, the failure to reliably follow explicit instructions and the weird inconsistencies between puzzle types. These challenge simple narratives about AI reasoning progress.
absolutely. This deep dive really makes you think. More thinking, or more compute, doesn't seem to be a silver bullet for robust reasoning, especially as complexity scales. It really underlines the difference between fluent generation and reliable, step-by-step logical execution.
It leaves you wondering how reliable these systems are for tasks needing that kind of precise, sequential logic, especially when the problem space gets tricky.
A lot to think about there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the illusion of thinking.